Fun enough or satisfying for you to ever get that feeling. You just get a headache. Hotel Mario was close to the mark, but in the end, it takes it all too far and ends up shooting itself in the foot. Glad to see the back of that one. Good work, everyone. Just take 5 and we'll start writing for the next video, okay? Probably a good time to figure out what that's gonna be, actually. Let's consult the good old barrel of ideas. Empty? No, no, no! Come on, there's gotta be something in here, even if I have to scrape it out.
Number 15, Stardew Valley Footladders.
No, too clickbaity.
What is up, everyone? It's your boy Alex coming at ya with Fortnite episode 5,700,000.
Okay, come on. I'm desperate, but I'm not that. Ugh, dang it. Huh? What is this?
Somebody wants.
Well, here goes nothing. Oh God, what have I done? What can you say about Shrek? What the heck can you say about Shrek?
Okay, somebody bury this.
Despite the glib smugness that gets thrown around as we titter and guffaw at ironic memes about the series, I think it's worth noting just how big of a deal Shrek really was in the early to mid-noughties. The original movie won the very first Best Animated Picture award at the Oscars. The franchise as a whole grossed a whopping $3.5 billion in the box office globally, and that's not even mentioning the whirlwind of a media dynasty the series brought together. Anyone want to head to the far, far away attraction at Universal Singapore? Or how about we enjoy a mint ogre-load McFlurry? That's disgusting. What I guess I'm trying to say is that Shrek was big, and if the musical and rumours of a 5th film are anything to go by, then I think it's safe to say that even now, 17 years on from Shrek's cinematic debut, we haven't seen the last of him just yet. But let's rewind a bit to the first movie. Being a popular movie in the early 2000s, you just know there's gotta be a video game tie-in, right? Developed by DICE and published by TDK a mere 6 months after the film's summer release, let's take a look at one of the launch titles for Microsoft's first home console. Here's 2001's Shrek for the Xbox. You know, I don't often like to consider a game's title screen as an early indicator of quality. I kinda find it cliché, but how am I meant to react to this? A meager demo scene text blitting against a still picture from the movie? Like, imagine if any other game opened like this. Whatever, let's just continue. After naming your file, you'll watch a short cutscene explaining the plot from the magic mirror. Princess Fiona's been kidnapped and captured by Merlin. No, not the Merlin from Shrek 3, this Merlin. He's taken her to his dark fortress Tower of Pure Evil, yes, that is what it's called by the way, for reasons entirely unknown and unexplained, and he's barricaded himself in with a thick fog that prevents you from entering. However, this fog can be broken by the power of good deeds, so Shrek heads out there to do as many as possible, because that's what you see when you look at Shrek, a doer of good deeds. Japes aside, this plot does work for a video game of this caliber, as bare bones as it may be. In fact, when you break it down, it's basically the same narrative as Super Mario 64. The primary difference between Shrek and Mario 64, though, is that Mario 64 doesn't make me want to kill myself quite as often as Shrek does. Where do I even begin describing this monstrosity? Perhaps in the mandatory tutorial in Shrek's Swamp, learning his basic moveset, which consists of running, jumping, kicking off walls, punches, kicks, grabs, all the standard platformer come beat 'em up fare. Shrek's only unique additions to the status quo here are dedicated buttons for farting and burping, which when combined with a chili pepper can let you make fart cloud explosions. Gross. Being unimaginative and unpleasant in concept is one thing, it's another for the execution to be just as bad. It's hard to describe exactly what's wrong with Shrek, but he tends to lurch around a lot, and it becomes incredibly frustrating trying to pull him in the direction you want to go. Even if you can, Shrek's hitbox is oddly slippery, and when that's combined with the absolute size of this lad, you'll find that often the platforming demanded of you is way too difficult, and you simply slide off edges constantly unless you land dead on. And when you factor in that there's no way to properly move Shrek about delicately, like nearly every other platformer had by this point, you get into a situation where he controls like he's been hit on the head a few too many times and can't go to the bathroom by himself anymore. You know what, looking at his face, I believe that story. Anyway, did I mention his running speed? Because oh my god, this makes F-Zero GX look like 50cc Mario Kart. Just watch him go! Here's the weird part though, that only happens when you move diagonally. Straight ahead he runs at a normal if brisk pace. Later on in my recording playthrough, I found out this phenomenon only occurs on one of my Xbox controllers as well, which is odd because both of them are official pads. I can't imagine this is the controller's fault, so I'm going to attribute it to the game. However, it doesn't detract any points yet, simply because of how much I used it to my advantage before the platforming turned into Tiny Space Hopfest. Though, credit where credit is due, Shrek's visuals are surprisingly respectable in a lot of ways. While they're often unfortunately too dark for you to actually tell, deferred shading is used extensively, which results in some striking lighting effects. Detailed bump mapping and dynamic shadows genuinely add a lot of depth to the landscapes you explore too. When you remember that this was released in 2001, it's definitely impressive the number of times it ends up looking as nice as Doom 3, a title 3 years its junior. It's honestly such a shame how many levels are as gloomy and poorly lit as they are, because in bright environments, Shrek's different worlds are very aesthetically pleasing indeed. Unfortunately, this level of detail doesn't quite translate properly to the characters. For as much as the cover artwork likes to brag that Todd McFarlane of Spider-Man and Spawn fame designed them, they don't translate to 3D as anything other than extraordinarily generic. These guys could seriously have come from a prefab asset CD and I wouldn't have been able to tell. Another gripe I have with Shrek is that there's little to no feedback to the combat. Here's the issue, this game requires you to fight enemies fairly often, be it punching, kicking, grabbing or stunning them, but it all feels somewhat ethereal. While hitting your enemy does show them flying off, the sound effects are extremely weak and there's no sort of hit spark to indicate you did indeed land a hit. Likewise, none of your opponent's attacks have any real teleprompting or wind-up, so often any scraps you get into will have you mashing the Y button trying desperately to land more punches in than they can, as it turns into a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure style flurry of fists. Also, can we talk about how dreadful and nauseating this camera is? When it's not getting caught on things, it swings about unpredictably or simply isn't coming inside with you, and it loves to lag behind your movements, often sitting underneath Shrek during any instances of wall jumping, i.e. the exact opposite of where I would want it to be when I'm trying to land on something. Not only that, but this camera only ever focuses on Shrek, which doesn't sound like that big of a problem when I say it until you're in the few boss fights. Think of other platformers, Spyro, Croc, Sonic Adventure, and notice that the camera is positioned so that you can not only see what you're doing, but what your enemy is doing as well. Whereas in Shrek, you'll mostly be trying to figure out what's attacking you while you lose more and more health until you die. It's such a drag. The level design is also substandard for a platformer of this era too. Large spaces, like the sewers, tend to be labyrinthine and confusing to navigate, but on the other end of the scale, Mother Goose Land and the Crypt are way too small and cramped for you to get much of a feel for. And speaking of small, there's no margin of error on most platforms, and they feel too tiny for you to maneuver Shrek's bulk to in a reliable fashion, especially when you pit them against the camera in buttery traction. Unsurprisingly, the various objectives plastered around these aren't a lot better. Most of the time, it only boils down to a few repetitive things like beating people up, going on fetch quests or scavenger hunts, and setting certain objects on fire with your bodily fluids. It gets monotonous, insanely fast, and monotonous turns into frustrating and tedious when the difficulty curve is implemented this poorly. In one of the first two stages, you're tasked with passing gas on a dancing cow. This was practically impossible because the cow was situated in a large open field and runs away whenever you approach. And since you have such a low amount of control over the direction of Shrek's bowel movements, it all comes down to luck. I only managed to get through this thanks to the speed glitch. However, when you're forced to do it again in one of the game's final levels, it's a lot easier since the cow is stuck in a little room with no hazards that it can't escape. Granted, the player has to do a decent amount of platforming to get to the dancing cow this time, but once they're up there, the task of actually farting on it is trivial at best. Sound is also hardly this title's strong suit. The soundtrack may be mostly competent, and none of the tunes are particularly annoying, but they're also extremely bland and uninteresting. I hardly expected any bangers from Shrek, but it all simply melts into the background. That's not too bad, but sound effects are wimpy and don't really have any impact to them. As mentioned before, punches and kicks have no oomph, and a lot of that is to do with them not making enough sound. But the few voiced characters...
Come on! Come here, you wanna fight? You hit me. No back. Hadouken! Charge! Hadouken! Yeah! Didn't see that coming.
I can't sleep at night. Shrek, do me a favor and pass some gas on her.
Just... what the hell is this? Expanding on that, throughout most of my playthrough, none of the atmosphere and humour of the films comes across in this dialogue, or anywhere else for that matter. As you bounce about, you'll be sure to notice that your ogre avatar is most certainly not voiced by Mike Myers, and in fact he's the only major trace of anything Shrek related in the whole thing. The dragon makes a minor cameo, and the gingerbread man is mentioned in text, but aside from that, Fiona is only a scapegoat for the plot, Farquaad only appears on the file select screen, and Donkey only appears on the GameCube port's cover. It's so strange. All in all, Shrek on Xbox bears next to no resemblance to the film it's based upon, especially in regards to quality. As early as the first cutscene, it's clear from the lazy, slapped-together excuse of a plot that almost no effort was placed into developing this. Game feel is wonky, cumbersome, and glitchy, and the combat feels numb and lifeless, though even if that weren't the case, it's not as if these levels would be fun when you have to wrestle with the difficulty curve rodeo, overcomplicated layouts, or something as basic as the camera angle. Probably the only positive to consider when looking at this is the graphics, which do shine through on occasion, but oftentimes you could render these characters and levels in pristine detail and they'd still be soul-suckingly boring because of how unimaginatively they've been designed. In the end, the visuals are pretty much all Shrek has going for it, and aside from that, you're in for a boring, uninspired few hours if you do go and pick this up. So I'd recommend staying away.